The alien Admiral stood at the heart of the bridge, a towering figure clad in armor forged from the hardest metals of their species. The stars outside the viewport were an endless sea of cold light, and distant promise the Admiral's species had conquered many worlds, their fleets stretched across galaxies. No enemy had ever stood a chance against them. Their technology was far beyond that of any race they had encountered, and their tactics were flawless. They were perfection in battle. Every conflict was a foregone conclusion. Every victory inevitable. The Admiral's fleet had been preparing for this moment for decades. Earth, a small blue planet on the outer rim of the galaxy, was their next target. The Admiral knew that this world would be no different from the others. It would be a simple conquest, a swift extermination of the primitive creatures that lived there. They had no idea how lucky they were to have been so chosen for such a merciful end. The Admiral's mind was clear, focused on the task ahead. There were no doubts, only certainty. Earth's pathetic defense forces had been scattered across the system, with no hope of unification or coordination. They were nothing but a distraction, a brief annoyance to be swept aside once the invasion began. The fleet moved silently through space, the immense warships with their sleek forms and gleaming surfaces floating in perfect formation. Each ship was a symbol of power and fear. The Admiral could feel the weight of history in the air. This was their species' greatest operation, the culmination of everything they had worked for. Earth would be the final prize in a campaign of absolute conquest. No resistance could withstand the firepower of this fleet. No military or technology could match their strength. As the Admiral paced the bridge, their eyes glanced at the holo interfaces, showing the vast array of Earth's defense systems across their planetary perimeter. The Admiral smirked. These defenses were laughable. Only a few remaining outposts that had resisted the first wave would continue to fight. They would fall as the others had before them. Nothing could change that. But as the Admiral continued to study the system's defensive positions, something on a lower deck of the flagship caught their attention. A strange signal, something faint but consistent, appeared on the monitoring systems. A faint flicker of light, almost lost among the numerous battle-ready communications from the fleet. The Admiral ordered it investigated, not out of any real interest, but simply out of habit. It was probably nothing more than a glitch, but the Admiral was always thorough. The signal led them to a small human shelter, a civilian bunker nestled deep within Earth's atmosphere. The source of the signal was coming from there, an oddity that seemed insignificant at first glance. But it was there, a young human child sitting alone in front of a glowing screen. The child was completely engrossed in something seemingly harmless. The Admiral's curiosity was piqued, and they leaned in closer to the monitor, studying the child's actions. The human child's fingers moved rapidly across the controls of a Starship simulator. It was a game, the Admiral thought dismissively at first. Children loved these simulations. They had no understanding of the real stakes of war. They were distractions, harmless fun. But as the Admiral observed the child's actions, something felt off. There was an unnatural precision to the way the child moved their fingers, a careful deliberation that felt almost too confident for someone so young. The Admiral paused, not sure why this moment felt different. What was it about this simple human game that had caught their attention so suddenly? The Admiral's eyes narrowed as they watched the child's hands dance across the simulator controls, each movement calculated and deliberate. The Admiral had seen warriors move with such precision, but not children. The child's brow furrowed in concentration as they manipulated the virtual starship, navigating through a digital field of asteroids and enemy craft. The game seemed simple at first. The Admiral thought there was no real threat, just a harmless simulation designed to entertain the young mind. But there was something in the way the child played that made the Admiral pause. Something they couldn't quite place. A flicker of curiosity began to worm its way into the Admiral's consciousness. Against their better judgment, the Admiral ordered a closer look at the simulation's parameters. The holo display shifted to show the child's gameplay in greater detail. The Admiral watched as the child maneuvered their digital fleet with exceptional skill. The Starship dodged incoming laser blasts at impossible angles, and then immediately retaliated with a volley of precision fire that wiped out an approaching enemy force. The child's reactions were almost instinctual, an uncanny ability to read the simulated environment, as if they were living the scenario in real time. Without hesitation, the child performed an intricate series of evasions and counterattacks that even seasoned human pilots had difficulty executing in live combat battles. The Admiral felt a strange unease stir deep within them. This was not the type of play the Admiral was familiar with. This was more than just a child's game. The more the Admiral studied the child's movements, the more they began to sense a pattern. There was an eerie familiarity to the tactics being used by the child. They were too refined, too calculated for something that should have been nothing more than a pastime. It was then that the Admiral realized something chilling. The child was not simply reacting to the game's challenges. They were thinking ahead. They were strategizing in ways that mirrored real combat scenarios, in a way that seemed far beyond what any human child should be capable of. And yet the Admiral couldn't deny it. The tactics being employed were not random. They were deliberate. The child was engaging with the game as if they were piloting a real starship, leading a fleet in actual battle. The Admiral's mind raced, trying to understand the implications of what they were witnessing. Was this some sort of anomaly? Had the child been trained in secret by human military commanders? Was this some kind of advanced simulation used to test military potential? The Admiral dismissed the thought too quickly. The child was too young, far too young, for such sophisticated training. As the Admiral continued to study the gameplay, the unease only grew stronger. The child's fleet began to engage more aggressive tactics, charging toward larger forces with seemingly reckless abandon. Yet each move was a calculated risk, paying off with flawless execution. The child's fleet adapted and responded in ways that no mere simulator could have predicted. It was as if the game had come alive, and the child was guiding it with a master's touch. The Admiral's thoughts turned sharply. The child's moves didn't match the standard patterns humans typically relied on. They didn't mirror any kind of textbook tactics. The child's strategies were improvisational, unpredictable, like they were breaking the rules of warfare itself, and doing so with remarkable success. The Admiral's mind flickered with something approaching fear, but they quickly suppressed it. The child was just playing a game after all, or so they tried to convince themselves, yet something gnawed at them. This was no ordinary child's play, and with every passing second the Admiral was less and less sure of what they were actually witnessing. The Admiral's gaze remained fixed on the holoscreen, watching the child's every move with increasing fascination. The Starship simulator, a simple game designed to entertain, had become something far more intricate, a battleground that felt oddly real. The child, with a concentrated frown, manipulated the controls with an expertise that defied explanation. Every move was deliberate, every decision immediate, as though the child had an innate understanding of the game's flow, as if they had seen these battles play out 1,000 times before. The Admiral's instincts screamed that something was wrong, but their curiosity overpowered the discomfort gnawing at the edges of their thoughts. The virtual enemies in the simulation began to grow more formidable. What was once a small fleet of scattered crafts became a well-organized swarm, an overwhelming force closing in on the child's fleet. The Admiral was sure the child would falter, that they would panic and make a mistake. But instead, the child responded with a remarkable calmness, a level-headed strategy that defied their age. Without hesitation, the child split the fleet into two sections, one to feint a retreat, the other to trap the advancing enemy in a devastating crossfire. The Admiral watched, utterly transfixed, as the enemy fleet was obliterated with ruthless efficiency, the child's virtual ships moving in perfect synchronization. The Admiral's mind raced. They had seen these kinds of tactics before, but never from such a young and inexperienced mind. These moves weren't the result of random chance. They were calculated, precise. The Admiral had faced enemies before who had shown similar tactical brilliance, but those enemies had years of training and battle experience. This child, by contrast, should have been completely unfamiliar with warfare on any meaningful level. Yet here they were, piloting a fleet with more skill than some seasoned military commanders. The Admiral's heart began to pound as they realized the implications of what they were watching. Was this simply an anomaly, or was there something more at play here? The child didn't seem to be playing for fun anymore. They weren't simply reacting to the game's challenges as one would expect. They were directing a full-scale battle. Their moves were so fluid, so sure, it felt as though the simulation was not just responding to the child's actions, but anticipating them. It was as if the game itself was following the child's lead, adapting to their every command with an eerie accuracy. The Admiral's hands tightened on the armrests of their command chair, an uncomfortable shiver creeping down their spine. How was this possible? How was this child so good? Another wave of enemy ships appeared on the screen, this time larger and more advanced than the previous forces. The child didn't hesitate. With a flick of their fingers, the fleet pivoted, dodging incoming fire with expert precision. They didn't just evade. They counterattacked, launching a flurry of missiles that tore through the advancing ships in an explosive display. The Admiral felt a surge of confusion and disbelief. The child's fleet was outnumbered, outgunned, yet it seemed to be winning. No, it was decisively winning, as though the game itself were bending to the will of this child's remarkable ability. The Admiral's mind struggled to comprehend the impossibility of what they were witnessing. There was no mistake here. The child wasn't just reacting to the game's mechanics. They were thinking several steps ahead, calculating the optimal strategy to win every encounter. It was as though the child had access to an advanced intellect that shouldn't be possible for someone their age. The Admiral had seen strategy before, in countless battles across the galaxy, but this was something different. This was a mind that saw warfare as an art, as a puzzle to be solved, a challenge to be outsmarted. The Admiral had never encountered anything like it in all their years of conquest. With each passing moment, the Admiral became more and more certain of one thing: this child was not simply playing a game. The Admiral didn't know how, didn't know why, but somehow, the child was not only a threat to the game's design. They were proving that humanity's capacity for tactical brilliance ran far deeper than anyone had ever anticipated. The Admiral's thoughts were a whirlwind, each one faster than the last. They had watched countless simulations, seen countless displays of human resilience and tactical ingenuity. But this was different. There was something unsettling about the way the child moved through the game, how each action seemed to have a purpose beyond simple victory. The child's decisions were unpredictable, yes, but not in a chaotic way. In a calculated manner that made every choice seem like a well-considered stroke in a larger strategy. The Admiral's eyes flicked to the fleet status board, then back to the child on the screen. The child wasn't just playing. They were commanding, leading a battle like someone who had been born to do so. The Admiral's mind struggled to make sense of what they were witnessing. The child's fleet had just pulled off another stunning victory, using a technique that was eerily similar to a real-world maneuver the Admiral's own species had perfected over millennia. The same feigned retreat, the same sudden turn to counterattack at the perfect moment. It was almost identical, a textbook strategy that the Admiral had executed in dozens of campaigns. But this was a child, a human child, who shouldn't know how to pull off such an advanced tactic, let alone intuitively weave it into the flow of a larger battle. How could this be? For the first time in their long career, the Admiral felt something they had never experienced: doubt. The foundation of their understanding of the war, of their entire approach to humanity as a whole, was crumbling before their eyes. This child was not simply an anomaly in the human population. This was something far more troubling. The child's skill was not the result of years of study or military training. It was instinct, raw and unfiltered, a natural gift for strategy that no one, least of all the Admiral, could have anticipated. The Admiral stared at the simulation, their mind racing. Could this be an isolated case? A freak occurrence? No. The more the Admiral watched, the more they realized the truth. This child was tapping into something universal in humanity's approach to warfare. It was not just the child's brilliance. It was the way humans adapted, how they never followed the rules, how they constantly found new ways to turn the tide of battle. It was the very essence of humanity itself, the refusal to accept defeat, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. The Admiral felt a deep unease settle in their chest. This was more than a child playing a game. This was a glimpse into the heart of humanity's resilience. And if this child could replicate military strategies so flawlessly in a simulation, what could they do in the real world? What could humanity do if every person on Earth had access to this kind of instinctual genius? The Admiral's stomach churned at the thought. The fleet, the carefully crafted strategies that had been perfected over centuries, none of it would matter if humanity could think outside of every box that the Admiral's species had constructed. The Admiral shook their head, trying to push the thought away. It was ridiculous, after all. Humanity was supposed to be inferior. They were supposed to be nothing more than a blip in the galaxy, easily eliminated, their resistance crushed beneath the might of the alien fleet. But now, the Admiral wasn't so sure. A child, no older than 10, had made them question everything. Suddenly, the child's fleet in the simulation took a sharp turn, evading a barrage of virtual missiles with an agility that made the Admiral's heart race. The maneuver was so precise, so perfectly timed, that it felt as though the game had been anticipating the move all along. It was impossible. The Admiral's mind flashed back to the strategy meetings, to the countless hours spent devising plans to wipe out the human forces. Could they really have underestimated humanity so badly? Could this one child represent an entire species' potential for victory? For the first time, the Admiral didn't feel confident in their victory. They didn't feel invincible anymore. They felt vulnerable. The Admiral's thoughts were a chaotic storm of realization. What had started as a casual observation had turned into something far more disturbing. The child's brilliance, so pure and unrefined, seemed to tap into a core element of humanity that the Admiral's species had failed to understand. A deep, almost primal ability to adapt and innovate under pressure. The child was not just playing a game. They were thinking on a level that the Admiral's species would struggle to replicate, even after millennia of warfare. Each move the child made in the simulator felt as though it were being shaped by some invisible hand, guided by a force beyond their years, beyond their training. The Admiral tried to shake off the gnawing feeling growing inside them, but it was impossible. It was as though this child, this small human, had unknowingly peeled back the curtain to reveal the true strength of humanity, a strength that the Admiral's species had never anticipated. It was the same strength that had allowed the humans to survive against all odds, to stand resilient against invaders far stronger and more advanced. The Admiral had heard rumors of humanity's surprising resourcefulness, stories of how they had turned the tides of battles with nothing more than sheer will and creativity. But seeing it firsthand, in such an unexpected form, left the Admiral uneasy. The more the Admiral watched, the more they began to understand the child's skill was not just the result of some lucky coincidence. It was an innate, unteachable gift, the ability to grasp and utilize complex strategies in the blink of an eye, to see patterns where others saw chaos. The child had made moves that would normally require decades of combat experience, but they were doing so with the ease of a seasoned general. What was even more disturbing was the sense of unrestrained freedom in the child's decisions. There were no rigid rules to follow, no constraints, only a relentless push to outmaneuver, outthink, and overpower. It was as though the game, the very simulation itself, was being rewritten with every keystroke, responding to the child's relentless creativity. A flicker of memory crossed the Admiral's mind. A battle from long ago, a skirmish against a race of beings far more intelligent than humanity. The Admiral had crushed them in a matter of days, their technological superiority rendering them completely helpless. But in the final days of the conflict, there had been one human ship that had defied all expectations, a single vessel with a handful of survivors, using tactics that seemed absurd, desperate, and yet somehow effective. The humans had refused to fight in the conventional way, instead using the environment, the very terrain of space itself, to their advantage. They had refused to follow the Admiral's carefully laid out plans, and in doing so, they had found a way to make the Admiral's fleets bleed. That final battle had been the turning point. The humans had lost, but they had proven something crucial, something that had stayed with the Admiral since that day. The humans' greatest strength was not in their numbers or their technology, but in their ability to think in ways that no other species could predict. They had a chaotic brilliance that defied all logic, and now the Admiral was witnessing it again. Only this time, it was embodied in the small, unassuming form of a child. The Admiral swallowed hard, a sudden wave of respect and fear washing over them. They had never been one to underestimate an enemy, but humanity had always seemed like a foregone conclusion. They had assumed that Earth's military would crumble under the might of their fleet, that it would be a simple matter of strategy to wipe them out. Yet, with every passing moment, the Admiral's confidence in that certainty began to slip away. This child was no fluke. This child was a symbol of something much greater. Humanity, it seemed, was not the weak species they had been led to believe. No, they were unpredictable, brilliant, and above all, dangerous. The Admiral turned away from the screen for a moment, glancing out at the dark expanse of space beyond the bridge. The stars were quiet, distant, indifferent to the impending war. But now, for the first time in the Admiral's life, they felt an unfamiliar pang of doubt, a deep uncertainty about the future. If one human child could show such potential, what would happen when humanity's full power was brought to bear? What kind of force would they become when they were truly united, when they recognized their own strength? The Admiral couldn't help but wonder. Had they misjudged humanity from the start? Had they underestimated the very thing that had allowed humans to survive all these years, their capacity to adapt and overcome? The Admiral stood at the command center, the weight of their growing uncertainty pressing heavily on their chest. They had seen battles before, countless conflicts fought across the stars. The Admiral had always relied on precision, on calculated tactics that followed a rigid set of principles honed over centuries. But what they were seeing now, in the performance of this single child, was a complete departure from all they had ever known about warfare. It wasn't just the brilliance in the child's decisions. It was the overwhelming sense that the child had no regard for conventional strategy, that they were operating on a level far beyond even the Admiral's own understanding. As the child's fleet continued to dismantle wave after wave of enemy ships in the simulation, the Admiral couldn't shake the feeling that they were witnessing a true shift in the balance of power. Each tactic was more unconventional than the last, more creative, and with each victory, the child seemed to learn, adapt, and evolve. It was as though the simulation itself was becoming more advanced in response to the child's actions, a living entity that was adapting to the child's mind in real time. The Admiral took a step back, running through the implications in their mind. The child's tactics were too precise, too adapted for them to be the product of mere chance. These moves weren't being learned from a training manual or passed down through traditional education. The child was improvising, creating new strategies on the fly that defied every expectation. The Admiral thought back to the early days of their own species' history, how they had been forced to fight for survival, adapting in ways that had shaped their evolution. They had become the apex predators of the galaxy because they had learned to think beyond the confines of tradition, to outsmart and outmaneuver their enemies. Could humanity be on the verge of developing the same kind of mentality, the same kind of brilliance? The more the Admiral watched, the more they realized something terrifying. This wasn't just an isolated case. If one human child could do this, then it stood to reason that there were others, perhaps many others, who possessed the same innate ability to see and create strategies that no one else could predict. The Admiral began to wonder if humanity's true strength lay not in their technological advancements, nor their military might, but in something far more insidious: their boundless creativity, their ability to break the rules and rewrite the game. The Admiral's eyes flicked back to the screen, where the child's fleet had just outmaneuvered yet another impossible force. The simulation was becoming a battlefield unlike any the Admiral had ever seen before. The child had broken through every barrier, every line of defense the game had to offer. And in that moment, the Admiral realized that this wasn't just a game anymore. The child had crossed a line, and the Admiral could no longer dismiss their actions as the naive moves of a young mind playing pretend. No, this child was acting with purpose. The Admiral had seen real combatants make moves like this. Veterans who had spent decades in battle, who had mastered the art of warfare. But this child, this human, had done it with the ease of someone born into the battlefield of the mind. And it wasn't just the tactics, it was the execution. The child wasn't simply reacting to a challenge. They were anticipating what the enemy would do, predicting it, and responding with a speed that no fleet, no military force, could match. A strange thought flickered in the Admiral's mind. Could it be that humanity's entire strategy for survival was encoded into their very genes? Was this ability to adapt, to think creatively, the hidden weapon that had allowed them to endure? The Admiral had seen it in humanity's past. Against far more powerful foes, they had always found a way to fight, to survive. But this was something different. This was a human child demonstrating the same kind of brilliance that had kept their species alive in the face of impossible odds. And if this child was capable of this, what would humanity be like when it fully realized the depths of their potential? The Admiral's chest tightened. Humanity's creativity was not something that could be predicted, not something that could be controlled. If this was the future of warfare, of humanity, then the Admiral was facing an entirely new kind of enemy, one that could not be defeated by strength or firepower alone. The Admiral felt a chill run down their spine. The game, it seemed, had already changed. The Admiral's thoughts raced as the child's fleet obliterated yet another wave of enemy ships with chilling precision. The game had shifted from a simple simulation to a high-stakes encounter, as though the child's actions were causing ripples in the very fabric of the digital world. Each move, each counterattack, was delivered with the confidence of a general who had spent decades studying the art of warfare. The child was no longer just playing a game. They were commanding a battle, and the Admiral could see it clearly now. Every tactic, every maneuver, was deliberate and expertly executed, pushing the boundaries of what the Admiral thought possible for a human of such tender years. But it wasn't just the tactics themselves that unsettled the Admiral. It was the growing realization that this child, this one insignificant human, was demonstrating something no one had anticipated. The future of warfare, at least for humanity, was evolving in a way the Admiral's species hadn't prepared for. The Admiral had always believed that their people were the pinnacle of military strategy and technological prowess, but watching the child's mind at work, it was clear that humanity was not as helpless as they had assumed. This child, no older than 10 or 12, was outthinking the game, finding weaknesses in its design, exploiting them in ways that even seasoned warriors couldn't have predicted. The Admiral felt a knot tighten in their gut. What if this was the beginning of something far larger? What if every human, every citizen on Earth, could learn to think like this child? The Admiral had seen the potential for tactical brilliance in humans before, individuals who had outsmarted the Admiral's species on rare occasions, always through unexpected means, but never like this. This wasn't just a lucky fluke. It was an innate ability, a spark of genius that was being honed with every move. The child wasn't simply responding to the game. They were rewriting the rules of the game itself. The Admiral had underestimated humanity in every possible way. They had thought of humans as predictable, as fragile, their strategies easily countered with superior technology and overwhelming force. But this was an entirely different threat. This child, with no more than a screen and a joystick, was taking the very concept of warfare into uncharted territory, a place where even the Admiral's vast intellect could not follow. And then, as if the game itself was reacting to the child's brilliance, The simulation began to change. The artificial enemies that had once been predictable started to adapt to the child's every move, shifting tactics and reconfiguring their fleet in real time. The Admiral blinked in surprise. It was as though the game, which had once been nothing more than a set of algorithms, was now evolving into something far more complex. The child's influence was rippling outward, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. The Admiral felt a deep unease settle in their bones. This was no longer just about a single child. This was about the future of humanity. If a mind so young could achieve such feats, what would the next generation of humans be capable of? What kind of warriors, what kind of strategists could they become once they unlocked the full potential of their creativity? The Admiral had seen species rise and fall, seen entire civilizations crushed by superior forces. But this was different. Humanity was not simply struggling to survive. They were evolving, rapidly and unpredictably, into something that could not be ignored. For the first time in the Admiral's long career, they felt a deep sense of doubt, a feeling they had never allowed themselves to entertain before. The certainty that had always guided their decisions, the belief that victory was inevitable, was slipping away. And it was slipping away because of a single child whose mind was proving that humanity's greatest weapon was not its technology or its firepower, but its ability to think, to adapt, and to change the very nature of warfare itself. The Admiral turned from the screen, staring out into the dark expanse of space beyond the viewport. The stars seemed distant, unreachable. They had always been the conquerors, the invincible force in the galaxy. But now, for the first time, the Admiral wondered if humanity might be the ones to rewrite the rules of war, and if the Admiral's fleet would be on the losing side of that new game. The Admiral stood motionless, staring at the dark expanse beyond the viewport, as the final moments of the child's gameplay unfolded on the screen before them. The game was nearing its end, and the child's fleet had once again outmaneuvered its virtual enemies with flawless execution. What had once been a simple test of reflexes had now become a demonstration of something far more profound, something the Admiral had never expected to encounter from a species they had once considered inferior. The simulation ended with a victorious flourish, the child's fleet standing unscathed amid the wreckage of their enemies. The Admiral didn't speak at first, too stunned to form the words that had been running through their mind for what felt like hours. The child was still staring at the screen, oblivious to the Admiral's presence, their small fingers resting lightly on the controls. The victory, so complete, seemed almost inevitable in the child's hands, almost as if the child had known the outcome before they'd even begun. But the Admiral knew better now. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. The child had won because they had bent the game to their will, exploiting every flaw in the simulation's design, adapting to the environment in ways that the Admiral's species would never have anticipated. They had seen patterns where no one else could. They had fought outside of the parameters. The Admiral let out a slow breath, their mind racing. What if this child wasn't the exception? What if there were countless others like them, waiting to be unleashed upon the galaxy? The Admiral's thoughts flashed back to all the campaigns they had overseen, the countless strategies they had devised with confidence, the victories they had claimed as inevitable. But this was different. Humanity was different. There was no formula to predict what they might do. Their ability to adapt, to innovate, to rewrite the rules of combat, this was not something that could be contained. The Admiral turned back to the screen, the realization settling heavily in their chest. Humanity was no longer the underdog, no longer the easy target. They were becoming something else, something more dangerous than the Admiral had ever anticipated. A species that would challenge the very concept of warfare. A species that would not only fight, but find ways to turn every battle into something entirely new, something that could not be countered by brute force or superior technology. The child, still immersed in their victory, seemed almost innocent, unaware of the gravity of the moment. The Admiral hesitated for a moment, watching the child's small, triumphant smile. There was no malicious intent in the child's eyes, only the pure joy of winning a game. But beneath that smile, the Admiral saw the faintest hint of something else, the spark of potential, the realization that this child, and every other human child like them, could one day lead armies, shape the future of warfare, and perhaps even reshape the entire balance of power in the galaxy. The Admiral knew, without a doubt, that humanity had become something far more dangerous than anyone had ever realized. The tactics they displayed, the sheer unpredictability and creativity in their thinking, were weapons that could not be countered by conventional means. The galaxy had always been a place where the strongest survived, where power and force determined the victor. But now, humanity had shown that they could break those rules. They could think outside the box, improvise, adapt, and fight in ways that no one could predict. The Admiral's gaze lingered on the child for a long moment. The realization was inescapable. The game was no longer just a game. Humanity had learned how to bend the rules of war itself, and in doing so, they had unlocked a power that could change everything. The Admiral turned sharply, addressing their officers with renewed urgency. "Prepare the fleet. This war is not going to be what we thought it would be." There was no turning back now. Humanity had proved itself to be a force that could not be underestimated. The Admiral didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was certain: whatever came next, humanity would not go down quietly. They would fight, adapt, and grow in ways that no one could anticipate. And that, above all else, made them the most dangerous species in the galaxy.